Okay, hello. So this is my kitchen, and today we're going to be talking all about food. And I'm going to introduce you to this, which is my Riverford organic, locally grown vegetable box. More about that later. Okay, so this is the specification of the globalisation section that we've done so far. You remember that we started off by understanding exactly what globalisation means and that word interdependence. You did a couple of questions on that quite recently. Then we start looking at changing levels of technology and communications, which have allowed certain parts of the world to become more globally connected than others. Remember, we sort of focused on things to do with decreasing times for air travel, improved connections through telephone calls, and then ultimately really superior internet connectivity through things like SeeMeWe 3 and SeeMeWe 4. Remember, I talked quite a lot about that guy who was able to now set up his sock factory in China. That was quite a good theoretical example. Then we have looked at the way in which industrialisation has changed in different parts of the world. This is something that we've looked at quite a lot throughout human geography and certain elements of our physical geography too, actually. The idea that as a country develops, it becomes less reliant upon agriculture at first and moves through to manufacturing, and then moves from manufacturing industry through to service industry. The situation that we have now in the UK, of course, is that the vast majority of people are working in service jobs, and all of the manufacturing has been moved to the overseas market, and we look particularly at China from that point of view. So I'd give that a tick. Remember, we looked very carefully at Shenzhen in one of the lessons, and that's a really good example of what's called a special economic zone. Then after that, we began by focusing on China through this as well, but we looked at energy and the way that as a country develops and the way that as a country globalises and becomes more developed and manufacturing increases, that its energy demands increase as well. So tick that one off too. And then most recently we've been looking at how sustainable development is very important, and that we must understand exactly how renewable energy should be playing a part in our future development. This is one of my pet topics, so I'll tick that off. So what we're going to start looking at now is this idea of food security, okay, and how in a globalized world where countries are increasing in population, we can work together to satisfy everybody's needs to eat. Right, so when we're thinking about food and food supply and food security, a good starting place is to have a look at those parts of the world which are undernourished. They are the people who, being undernourished means that you don't have enough food to meet your daily allowance of calories. It also might mean perhaps that you aren't getting enough of the right sorts of food. So maybe some countries might be lacking in certain types of fruit and vegetable, or maybe certain countries might be lacking in sources of protein as well. So take a look at this map, and this is from 2009. This is some UN data, and there's several colours that you can see. Just take a quick look at the key on the left-hand side there. It says percentage of population undernourished, and it ranges from 35% of the population down to less than 2.5% of the population. And then there's some grey colours there which shows no data. If you could please, just whilst you're making some notes here, just make a note of three statements which you know to be true based upon this map. Okay, so three statements that perhaps you could draw from this map. So for example, you might say that the majority of Europe and North America experiences a level of undernourishment which is less than 2.5%. Okay, so that would be quite a good statement. I think that sort of ties in with our general understanding of all the human geography that we've looked at so far. You might also want to say that the highest percentages of undernourishment are in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, you can see that area of maroon colour there. And then if you perhaps look at Eastern Asia, Southern and Eastern Asia, you might say that in Southern and Eastern Asia they experience medium levels of undernourishment, between 5 and 34% of their of their populations. Incidentally, I think that 35% should actually read more than 35%, more than 35%. Okay. Now, there's lots of ways and lots of reasons actually that you can sort of use to explain this. In my opinion, the sort of the key controlling factor here is climate. Now, we know Africa to be generally a very, very hot and dry country. They do receive rainfall, however, it's very seasonal, so you tend to get all of your rain in a 6 to 8 week period of the year, and that can make farming difficult. There are some other reasons, though, why this is the case. For example, the population in Africa is rising very, very quickly. There's something that you perhaps remember looking at in Year 9, which is called the demographic transition model. And many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so many countries that are that maroon colour, are in stages 2 and 3 of the demographic transition model. This means they have very, very high birth rates and their death rates are decreasing. As a general rule. So their population is growing. Now, if your population is growing, that means that you need to grow more food to supply to them. And the way that that's occurred, or the way that occurs in Europe and North America, is through highly intensive technological farming. So the employment of things like irrigation and fertilizers and pesticides to make sure that the food can be grown to feed the population. Some of this technology is absent throughout large parts of Africa, so that means that they can't grow enough food to satisfy their population. Another problem that Africa is experiencing, which is adding to the undernourishment situation, is HIV and AIDS. Now, HIV and AIDS is a hugely debilitating disease which leads to death. Some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, highlighted there in that maroon colour, have HIV/AIDS rates in excess of 25% of their population. So Botswana, for example, which is a country just to the north of South Africa. Let me just see if I can highlight that. That just about works there. Okay, Botswana, writing like a child. Let's just call it, Botswana. Okay, Botswana, and the data on this is quite sketchy, but is reported to have rates of HIV/AIDS of up to 25% of its total population. That does two things. Of course, it increases the death rate, but at the same time, it also means that people who are suffering from HIV, their productivity in work will decrease. So this has actually impacts upon all sectors of the economy, but food production is also one of those things. Now, there's another thing as well that we need to think about too, is that those countries in sub-Saharan Africa are rapidly urbanising. So we've looked at that in the changing urban environment section. In the developing world, levels of urban population are increasing very, very rapidly. In the world as a whole, the urban population is now over 50%. Well, there's a disconnection there, isn't there? If your total population is increasing and your rural population is declining, well then that means that the amount of food that's going to be produced is also going to decrease, isn't it? Because rural areas are those which are associated with food production, so if people are stopping farming and moving to the cities, that means farming declines. A really interesting bit of geography actually associated with this is that actually in parts of Africa, well, not just in Africa, actually, in many parts of the world where urban populations are growing, you're starting to see more urban farms. So people are using green spaces in cities to grow food for themselves. And this is a really, really good use of space. Actually, some controversy in the developed world. There's these things called... sorry, just lost it there. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so lots of people from rural areas in parts of Africa will arrive in cities and they won't have the work or the skills to be able to get themselves work in service industries. So one way they're getting around that is actually doing some farming on the urban fringes. But anyway, hopefully you can understand the pattern that shows us where undernourishment exists in the globe. Well, what has this got to do with globalisation? Well, one of the reasons why these countries in North America there and in Western Europe and throughout Russia too, and you can include Australia there, so this is all the richest countries in the world. One reason why they're able to have such low levels of undernourishment is that they are able to fill in the gaps of anything in their own domestic food supply by taking food from poorer parts of the world or other parts of the world. So a lot of the food that we eat comes to us from abroad. This concept is known as food miles. Food miles. Okay, so I quite like this this diagram, and we can use it as a good sort of counterpoint to the undernourishment across the globe that we saw in that last picture. Now, this is a lifestyle diagram which shows the most obese people, or rather the most obese countries in the world by percentage of their people. Okay, and you can see right at the top there, probably no surprise, the USA, 31%. Okay, that's quite a lot of obese people. And then look at us, the UK. We shouldn't really be sort of thinking too highly of ourselves. 23% of the population is obese. Almost a quarter. Then as we move down through, I suppose some countries closer to home that we might be familiar with. There we go, Germany, 13% of the population obese. That's 10% less than us. And then we've got France down here, quite a skinny nation, or perhaps we can say quite an unobese nation by comparison. And all the way down here, we've got Japan and Korea. Okay, so. In essence, you can see that you know, partly to explain, the wealthier the country, the more chance that it has to have many obese people. We can see that there's no countries on this list that we consider to be low or middle income. I mentioned food miles a little bit earlier, and this is a good diagram and a definition which allows you to understand what this concept is all about. So there's a definition for you, just reminding you that if you haven't been doing so already, you should be jotting a few things down as you're watching this presentation. So here's one thing that's good to write down. So food miles, this is the distance food travels before being eaten. And this is a key feature of globalisation. You can quite clearly see from that diagram down there, and these are fairly sort of average things, I suppose, that we might be eating on a day-to-day basis. So 5,000 miles for Californian oranges, 4,000 miles from bananas from the West Indies, 7,000 miles from Argentinian beef, 1,000 miles for tomatoes from Spain, 3,000 miles for cocoa beans that might go into your hot chocolate or your chocolate bar from Central Africa, and then 11,000 miles for lamb that comes from New Zealand. Now, this is all, good. These foods are very, very tasty. They're things that we enjoy eating. They tend to get to us mostly by ship as well. And you can see that some foods have a larger food mileage than others. Of course, every time you eat these foods that have travelled a long time, you're also consuming the carbon footprint that goes along with the transport that they've got. Okay, now this is not a new thing, but it is something that globalisation has increased. And things have been traded for hundreds and thousands of years, of course. And so food miles is not a new phenomena, but it's something that we need to think carefully about when we're thinking about globalisation. Lots of people try to now consume food where their food miles are massively decreased. So, for example, you can go to restaurants in London where you only eat things on the menu that are produced within the M25. So the food miles there are much reduced. Okay, but of course, why are these food miles come about? Because if we only ate things, I suppose, that were grown on the British Isles, potentially our diet could be quite bland. But we're interested in sweet things and spicy things and exotic fruits and fine beef, and the cost of producing these sorts of things is cheaper abroad. So it cuts down the price of everything that we're eating as well. On top of that, if we only ate seasonal foods, seasonal vegetables, for example, then again our diets would be quite bland at certain times of the year. We like being able to walk into the supermarket during the middle of December and seeing tomatoes on the shelves or seeing pineapples on the shelves, things that we can eat that are exotic, and so we need to import them. Incidentally, if we think about tomatoes, there's enormous greenhouses that exist in southern Spain where all the tomatoes are grown, and because they're doing it on such a large scale, it means that we can have tomatoes very, very cheaply.